I still remember the exact moment I was told I'd be living in the garage. It wasn't some dramatic, movie-worthy confrontation. No yelling, no slamming doors. Just a quiet, cold decree delivered by Ron, my mother's new husband, over dinner as he cleared his throat and announced that, since we were now a blended family, we all needed to make sacrifices. Sacrifices, it turned out, meant I had to give up my room to one of his kids while I was temporarily moved to the garage. My mother didn't argue. She sat there stirring her tea like it was just another Tuesday, her eyes avoiding mine. I remember staring at her for a long time, hoping for a sign of resistance, a flicker of concern, anything. But all I got was that same worn-down gaze she'd adopted ever since marrying Ron, a man who carried himself like he owned everything, including us. I was 15. My bedroom wasn't just a place to sleep. It was the only corner of the world I could call mine. It had my books, my photos, the desk where I'd spend hours trying to get good grades because I believed, somewhere deep down, that education would be my way out. But all that was swept aside in a single evening. The next day, I came home from school and found my mattress dragged into the garage, along with a lamp and a folding chair. That was it. The garage reeked of mildew and motor oil. There was a draft that seeped through the cracks of the metal door, no matter how many towels I stuffed along the edges. In winter, I'd sleep in a coat with gloves on. In summer, it was suffocatingly hot, and mosquitoes would sneak in through a broken window pane no one ever bothered to fix. There were no proper outlets, no insulation, and no privacy. Still, I learned not to complain. Complaining only made things worse. Ron had 2 kids from his previous marriage, Logan, who was 17 and acted like a mini version of his father, and Kayla, who was 13 but already had a sense of entitlement that filled every room she walked into. They got the bedrooms upstairs, big ones, with working radiators, carpeted floors, and posters on the walls. I wasn't allowed to go up there. My mother said it would be disrespectful to their space. I began waking up an hour earlier than everyone else, just to sneak into the kitchen, grab breakfast, and get ready before the others came down. I hated the glances Ron gave me in the mornings, like I was an inconvenience that hadn't been fully removed yet. My mother would sometimes try to make small talk, asking about school or whether I had enough for lunch money, but it always felt like a performance, like she wanted credit for parenting without actually parenting. I usually just nodded and left as quickly as I could. School became my sanctuary. I threw myself into it, not because I loved every subject, but because it was the only place where I was treated like a person. My teachers liked me because I did the work, handed things in early, and asked thoughtful questions. Some of them knew something wasn't quite right at home. One teacher, Miss Klein, once pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. Elite. I told her we were renovating the house, and I had to sleep in the garage for a while. She seemed skeptical, but let it go. In the afternoons, I worked part-time at a local grocery store, bagging items and collecting carts. It wasn't glamorous, but I was allowed to take home expired goods, which meant I could stash granola bars, juice boxes, and crackers under my bed, a luxury when the kitchen was off-limits to me after 7 p.m. Ron had imposed kitchen hours, and if I wasn't out by then, I'd get glared at or shooed away with passive-aggressive sighs. Despite everything, I never let my grades slip. I spent my nights studying with a flashlight under the blanket when the overhead light attracted too many bugs. I used an old laptop I found at a thrift store and fixed up with parts one bought piece by piece for my meager paychecks. I taught myself how to write code. I studied business concepts online. I read biographies of people who came from nothing and made something of themselves. It gave me hope, and more importantly, it gave me a goal. By my junior year, I was applying for scholarships. I'd wait until everyone was asleep, then sneak into the main house to use the Wi-Fi. I memorized all the login passwords, deleted my browsing history after every use, and never made a sound. I had to be invisible. It became a game of survival, a quiet rebellion. Then came a night that changed everything. I received a full scholarship offer from a university across the country. Full tuition, housing meal plan, everything. I stared at the email for hours, my hands shaking. I didn't cry. I couldn't afford to cry. I knew I had to leave quietly, without fanfare. If I made a big deal out of it, Ron would find a way to ruin it. On my 18th birthday, I packed up my things. It wasn't much: some clothes, my books, a secondhand tablet, and a framed photo of my dad, the only parent who ever made me feel safe. He had died when I was 10, and sometimes I'd talk to him in the dark just to feel like someone was listening. I didn't say goodbye to Ron. I barely said anything to my mother. She hugged me at the door and whispered, "I hope you don't resent me." I didn't answer. What was the point? I boarded a bus to the airport and flew out of that city with $27 in my pocket and a future I was determined to build brick by brick. Living in that garage had broken something in me, but it had also ignited something else: a quiet, unshakable resolve. I knew I'd never let anyone put me in a corner again. I wouldn't demand respect. I'd earn it. And someday, when I had real power, I'd remember how it felt to have none. That promise stayed with me long after I left. Through the lonely first months of college, through the exhausting grind of working multiple jobs, and through every moment when I thought I might not make it, I carried that garage in the back of my mind, not as a wound, but as a reminder that I came from concrete floors, and I was headed for something far greater. College didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like survival with slightly better walls. I landed in a place I had never been before, surrounded by strangers who came from worlds I couldn't relate to. My roommates had parents who dropped them off, who hugged them, helped them unpack, bought them dorm essentials in neat matching sets. I arrived with a duffel bag, one suitcase, and an old prepaid phone with a cracked screen. I didn't tell anyone that I'd come from a garage. I just said my family kept things simple. I shared a room with a girl named Tasha, who wore designer boots and thought instant noodles were cute. She wasn't cruel, just oblivious. When she asked me why I worked late nights at the campus cafe and still did freelance website building on the side, I just told her I liked keeping busy. She assumed I was ambitious. In truth, I didn't have a choice. I had to buy my own textbooks, toiletries, food between meal plans, and clothes when the seasons changed. There were weeks when I stretched a $20 bill over 5 days. I became an expert at collecting leftovers from club meetings and student events. I smiled through it, and nobody asked questions. I majored in business administration with a focus on logistics and operations. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. I took every class that taught me how to run things, how systems work, how supply chains move, how companies think. I didn't just want to get a degree. I wanted to understand how to build an empire. While other students took summers off to travel or rest, I worked. I interned at a shipping warehouse my freshman year, doing data entry for inventory tracking. The following year, I moved up to assistant scheduling coordinator for a local delivery company, where I learned the art of efficiency, how time, people, and resources could be aligned like clockwork. I kept my ears open and watched how managers operated, how they handled stress, how they failed or succeeded. I asked questions that most interns never asked. I volunteered for late shifts. By the end of every internship, someone in management would pull me aside and say, "You've got a real head for this." I'd smile and say thank you. I never told them why I worked like I had something to prove. By the time I graduated, I had 4 internships, 2 certifications, and a resume more packed than most people my age. I still remember the day I walked across the stage in my rented graduation gown. I didn't invite anyone. No mother, no stepfather, no one from that house. I didn't need their applause. My diploma was mine, paid for with sweat, late nights, and a promise I made in a cold garage years ago. The first full-time job I got was with a tech-driven logistics company called Terra Nova Transit Solutions. They were a mid-sized firm at the time, growing fast and always hunting for problem solvers. I started as an operations analyst. Entry level, long hours, modest pay. I dove in with the same intensity I'd carried through college. I spotted inefficiencies in scheduling software that saved the company $50,000 annually. I didn't wait to be asked. I wrote a report, pitched it to my manager, and helped implement it. A month later, I was promoted. My team began to rely on me not just for number crunching, but for decision making. I developed a reputation for cutting through chaos, making hard calls under pressure, and staying calm even when shipments got delayed or clients threatened to pull contracts. I didn't panic. I assessed, acted, and always followed through. In less than 2 years, I became a department lead. I managed 15 people, many of whom were older than me. It wasn't always easy. Earning respect at 24, especially as a woman in logistics, meant being 10 times more prepared than anyone else in the room. But I didn't mind. I wasn't interested in being liked. I was there to deliver results. At night, I still studied. I enrolled in leadership courses. I taught myself negotiation strategies. I read every book I could find on scalable infrastructure and operational bottlenecks. I didn't date much. I didn't party. My social life consisted of work dinners and networking events where I listened more than I talked and made mental notes about the kind of leader I wanted to become. While others dreamed of corner offices and titles, I dreamed of control, of never again having to depend on someone else's mercy or approval. 3 years into my career, Terra Nova acquired 2 regional companies and expanded its reach across 3 new states. I was asked to spearhead integration for one of the new territories. It was the biggest task I'd ever been given. Restructure systems, retain key talent, align operations, and restore profitability. The branch I was assigned to had been underperforming for years and was riddled with managerial dysfunction. I said yes without hesitation. The territory was rough. The old guard resisted change, the systems were outdated, and morale was low. I didn't barge in swinging. I observed. I listened. I met with every department head individually, even warehouse shift leads. I asked what wasn't working and what they wished leadership understood. I started with small changes, updating scheduling protocols, adjusting delivery targets, and offering performance bonuses for teams that exceeded metrics. When I implemented those improvements and followed up consistently, the attitude shifted. People began to trust me, not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. It was during one of those integration meetings that I came across a familiar name on the management roster, Ronald T. McGowan, Senior Operations Supervisor. My hands froze on the keyboard. For a moment, I thought it had to be someone else. But the employee photo, older, grayer, and more haggard, confirmed it. It was him, my stepfather. I sat there for a long moment, silent. A strange mix of emotions bubbled up. Not rage, not fear, just a quiet awareness that the past had walked into the room uninvited. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask for him to be removed. I didn't call him or warn him. I simply added him to the list of managers I'd be meeting during my transition visit. I didn't want revenge. I wanted professionalism. I wanted to look that man in the eye and show him, without saying a single word, just how far I had come. The week before I traveled to the newly acquired branch, I worked late every night preparing audits, reviewing personnel files, and designing a new operational flowchart. I was calm, focused, and more confident than I'd ever been. I was no longer the girl from the garage. I was the woman leading an entire division of a multi-million-dollar company. And I was going to walk through that door with my head held high. When I finally boarded the flight, I sat by the window, watching the clouds drift below. The cabin was quiet, the hum of the engine soft and steady. In that moment, I realized something. I had become exactly the person I once dreamed I could be. Someone with the power to shape her own future. And soon, very soon, the man who once saw me as disposable would have to call me boss. The first time I saw him again, he didn't recognize me. It was surreal. Walking into that office building and seeing his name on the door of a glass-walled office, printed in bold black letters on a plaque that read Ronald T. McGowan, Senior Operations Supervisor. His handwriting had once scribbled my name on a garage chore list taped to the inside of a freezer. Now his name was behind glass, but the authority it implied didn't impress me. I knew that title was a facade, a remnant of someone trying to hold on to a position they no longer deserved. The branch headquarters of the newly acquired territory was older, worn down, with buzzing fluorescent lights and beige paint curling at the corners. There was a tense air in the building, the kind that settles in when leadership is in flux and employees are waiting to see if they still have a job. I walked in confidently, business casual attire perfectly pressed, clipboard in hand, company badge clipped to my collar. My assistant, Hannah, followed closely behind, occasionally whispering names as we passed unfamiliar faces. Most people didn't know who I was yet, but they could tell I wasn't just another visitor. People notice when someone walks with purpose, I spent the first half of the day in meetings, briefings with department leads, reviewing past performance metrics, identifying redundancies and bottlenecks. My voice was firm but fair. I didn't bark orders. I asked questions that demanded clarity. I could sense the resistance beginning to loosen. People wanted a reason to believe things could improve. I made it my job to give them that reason. It wasn't until after lunch that I met Ron face to face. He walked in the conference room holding a coffee and a clipboard, chatting with someone from facilities about new shelving. The moment he saw me seated at the head of the table, his face paused mid-sentence. He blinked once, twice, then tilted his head, as if trying to place where he knew me from. I didn't flinch. I gave him a polite smile and said, "Mr. McGowan, glad you could join us." He sat down slowly, and the color drained from his face as recognition hit him. He didn't speak right away. He just stared. The lines on his face had deepened. His once imposing posture looked diminished now, as though years of mediocre leadership and unspoken bitterness had worn him down. His hair was thinner, his shoulders slouched slightly. There was no trace of the man who once told me I was a burden. But I hadn't come to punish him. I had come to lead. The meeting proceeded as scheduled. I laid out the new integration plan, assigned teams to transition tasks, and outlined expectations. I called on each manager by name to offer feedback. When I reached Ron, he was still visibly shaken. He cleared his throat and mumbled something about maintaining warehouse efficiency through vendor consolidation. I nodded, thanked him, and moved on without pause. After the meeting, I stayed behind to go over reports. Ron lingered near the door. "You've grown," he said awkwardly. I didn't look up from my papers. "It's been a long time." He stepped into the room, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was invited to speak or standing on the edge of courtroom. "I didn't know you worked here," he added. "I don't. I oversee the operations for this region now. Your branch falls under my supervision." He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's unexpected." "Things change," I said. "People grow." He stood silently, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I waited. I wanted to see what he would do with this moment. Would he apologize? Would he ask for understanding? Would he pretend none of it happened? "You probably still think badly of me," he said, his tone defensive. "No," I said flatly. "I don't think of you at all." It landed like a punch. He recoiled slightly, then nodded. "Fair enough." The conversation ended there. I turned back to my work, and he left. I could feel his gaze as he walked away, heavy with the weight of a past he had tried to bury. But I had no interest in reliving it. The power was no longer his. It was mine. Over the next few days, I began auditing the department he managed. I treated it like every other team. No special attention, no vendetta. I reviewed schedules, vendor contracts, delivery timelines, staff reviews, and incident logs. The data didn't lie. His team had been underperforming for months. There were reports of miscommunications, late shipments, inventory mismatches, and low employee morale. I interviewed warehouse workers who admitted they were afraid to escalate problems because Ron was dismissive or passive-aggressive. The longer I looked, the clearer it became. He wasn't just a bad father figure. He was also a bad leader. At the end of the week, I held individual review sessions. When Ron sat across from me in the small HR room, he tried to maintain composure, but his body language betrayed him. Fidgeting fingers, darting eyes, shallow breaths. I began the meeting the same way I did with every other manager, by laying out the performance metrics. "You've missed 7 out of 10 efficiency benchmarks in the last quarter," I said. "Employee satisfaction surveys in your department are the lowest across all units. Multiple complaints have been filed about your response times and failure to implement scheduled changes." He nodded slowly. "I know it hasn't been perfect, but it's been a tough quarter. It's been a tough year," I corrected him. "And leadership is about more than excuses. It's about accountability." He looked away, jaw clenched. "So what now? You're going to fire me?" "No," I said. "You're being given an option. Step down to a warehouse floor supervisor role. Less pay, fewer responsibilities, more oversight, or submit your resignation." He stared at me in disbelief. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about performance," I said. "This isn't personal. This is about standards." His face twisted into something bitter. "You think you're better than me now?" "No," I replied calmly. "I know I am. Silence fell between us, thick and uncomfortable. For a brief second, I saw something break behind his eyes, pride, ego, denial, maybe all of it. He stood up, fists clenched at his sides. "You always thought you were smarter than everyone," he said. "No," I said again. "I just worked harder than you ever did." And with that, he walked out. The next day, HR received his resignation. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't leave a farewell email. He just disappeared, like a chapter finally closed. There was no celebration. No dramatic reveal. I didn't tell anyone the history between us. I didn't need to. My revenge had already played out, not in screams or vengeance, but in results. In the fact that I was now everything he once told me I couldn't be. I spent the rest of the month rebuilding the team he left behind. I promoted someone from within. Marcia, a brilliant warehouse lead who had quietly held everything together despite being overlooked. I implemented a mentorship program, streamlined inventory systems, and introduced anonymous feedback loops to make sure no one ever felt silenced again. The branch began to turn around. Numbers climbed. Turnover dropped. Productivity soared. And I moved on to my next region, my next challenge. But every time I walked past a glass office with a manager's name on it, I remembered a name that used to mean fear, now reduced to a file in an HR drawer. Ron McGowan had once put me in a garage. Now I put him out of job, and not out of spite, but because I become the kind of boss who didn't tolerate mediocrity, even when it came wearing a familiar face. I didn't expect to hear about Ron again. After his resignation, he vanished from the company records like a name erased from a chalkboard. I didn't follow up on where he went or what he did. I had no interest in tracking the life of a man who once controlled mine. But life has a strange way of bringing echoes from the past when you least expect them. 6 months after he left, I was attending a logistics innovation summit in Denver. It was a high-profile event for industry leaders, full of panels, product showcases, and speeches by executives from across the country. I was scheduled to speak about adaptive strategies in supply chain recovery post-acquisition, a topic that only a few years ago would have been too advanced for someone in my age bracket to deliver, but now it was exactly why I'd been invited. As I walked through the exhibition hall, reviewing the itinerary on my tablet, I spotted a familiar figure near a booth marked with a startup logistics firm logo. He wore a lanyard like everyone else, but it was turned backward. I recognized him by his slouched posture before I saw his face. Ron was there. He wasn't the focus of the booth. He wasn't even at the forefront. He stood off to the side, clearly not the face of the company, handing out flyers without much energy. His clothes were slightly wrinkled, his eyes dull. When our eyes met, he stiffened. I nodded once, just a civil acknowledgement, and kept walking. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was distance, the kind that time and growth build between two people who once shared the same roof, but now lived in opposite emotional worlds. He had become irrelevant to the chapter one was writing, but I had not forgotten the foundation he unintentionally gave me, the fire to become something greater. Later that afternoon, I delivered my talk. The room was full, professionals, executives, journalists, students. I spoke with calm authority, drawing from real data, practical strategies, and stories from the field, leaving out, of course, the personal one. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. One of the attendees told me afterward that she'd never seen someone so young speak with such command. I smiled. I didn't tell her that I earned that command in a garage at 15 years old with a flashlight and frozen fingers. That year marked a shift. After 3 consecutive successful territory integrations and measurable increases in company-wide efficiency, I was promoted to Vice President of Regional Operations. I moved into a new apartment in a part of the city where everything was clean, safe, and warm. There was no draft coming under the doors, no mildew in the corners. I had soft lighting, hardwood floors, and shelves lined with books I had once borrowed from libraries. There was a framed photo of my father by the window. Every time I walked past it, I remembered why I had started. Despite the comfort, I never forgot where I came from. I didn't let wealth or power dull my empathy. I remembered what it was like to be voiceless, overlooked, and displaced. I remembered the cold of that garage and the silence of a mother who couldn't or wouldn't protect me. So I decided to do something with the success I had earned. I quietly started a mentorship program called Rise Room, targeted toward teenagers from broken homes, kids in foster care, or students who had to work jobs after school just to survive. It wasn't charity. It was investment. I provided laptops, access to online courses, mentorship hours, and even internships through my company. I met a few of the students myself. One girl reminded me so much of who I used to be, I had to excuse myself after the meeting just to breathe. I also began working with HR to create a more inclusive feedback culture company-wide. I pushed for anonymous reporting, regular well-being check-ins, and leadership accountability policies. I didn't want another version of Ron working under the radar, crushing people with cold silence and incompetence. If I was going to lead, it had to be with purpose. One day, I got a message from Marcia, the woman I'd promoted to lead operations after Ron left. She had just been accepted into a leadership development program and wanted to thank me. "No one ever saw me until you came," she wrote. I sat with that for a while. Sometimes justice isn't in public wins. It's in the quiet empowerment of others. A year later, a new merger brought our company into negotiations with several small struggling firms, one of which, as I later learned, had employed Ron for a brief time. I saw the acquisition report. His name was there in passing. He had been let go after only 5 months. Performance issues, interpersonal conflict, resistance to policy changes. I didn't dwell on it. I didn't bring it up in meetings. The past didn't deserve that much space. I never spoke to my mother again after I left. Occasionally, I saw her name in the background of social media searches, tagged in a family photo at some birthday or holiday. She looked older, tired. I don't know if she ever tried to reach me. I never went back to check. I had made peace not with her, but with the decision to move on without her. The story didn't end in a courtroom. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful apology. And that was fine with me. Life had offered me something far greater than revenge. It had given me transformation. In the end, I became everything I wasn't supposed to become. I built my own life, brick by brick, without help, without shortcuts. I didn't become hard or cruel. I didn't carry anger like a badge. I just worked. I just grew. And slowly, the memory of the garage faded. Not erased, but absorbed into something larger. Justice didn't come in flames. It came quietly. It came when I sat behind my own desk, in a warm office lined with plants and books, answering emails about decisions that impacted thousands. It came when someone called me ma'am with respect. It came when I helped a teenager find her footing and saw the spark in her eyes as she said, "You mean someone like me could do this too?" That was the moment I knew I had truly won. Not because I became my stepfather's boss, but because I became the person I needed most when I was a child. And nothing he ever did could take that from me.